Thank you so much. Hi, guys. Well, good morning. Is it morning? Is it still morning? Yes, it is. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Stéphane, and it's such a pleasure to be here for the second day of this amazing festival. We are happy, very happy and proud to support this festival, in particular this session. And it's my pleasure to introduce the session by introducing Linda Spalding, another of the great Canadian authors that we're so proud of that have been able to participate. In fact, Linda was born in Topeka, Kansas. And so that Kansas is part of the territory that I cover. It's beautiful. Topeka is a beautiful town. And Linda now lives in Toronto with her husband, her dog Jasper, and her cat Jack. Yes, cat lovers like me. Mrs. Spalding is a fiction and non-fiction writer. Her work explores world cultures and the clash between contemporary life and traditional beliefs. Her novel, The Purchase, which is available downstairs, won the Canadian Governor General's Literary Prize for Fiction. Mrs. Spalding is also well known for Who Named the Knife?, the true story of the murder trial of Marianne Acker, a teenager sentenced to life in prison for murder committed while on honeymoon in Hawaii. Mrs. Spalding, who served on the jury, tracks down Marianne 20 years later in order to re-examine the murder and the question of Marianne's innocence. From our discussion earlier, Linda and I understand that Mrs. Spalding feels very Canadian in her own values, as well as, of course, American. She believes that Canada, while, we have things to work on in Canada, of course, has acted over its history and in modern times as a place for refuge for many fleeing persecution and hardships. So I give you this session and Mrs. Linda Spalding. Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks everybody for coming. I'm Arsen Kashkashian. I host a radio show here in Boulder on KGNU, where we interview authors once a month, and I'm also the general manager of the Boulder Bookstore. So, so we're just going to dive right in, okay? So The Purchase and a Reckoning tells the story of 3 generations of a Quaker family exiled from Pennsylvania in 1798. In richly detailed prose, Spalding recounts their dangerous wagon ride into southwestern Virginia and how, despite being abolitionists, they get ensnared in the cruelty and the inhumanity of slavery. In A Reckoning, which is the newest book, set in 1855, the family is once again in a wagon, but this time they're headed towards Missouri and Kansas. The slaves, inspired by Canadian abolitionists, have run away, and the patriarch of the family is left suicidal. But perhaps the most important character is a bear named Cuff, who we will get to later, and that the youngest son of the family, Martin, has adopted this bear. It's really kind of a fascinating part of this tale. But first I wanted to kind of start at the beginning of these 2 books. Daniel Dickinson, he's the Quaker father who brings his family to southwestern Virginia in 1798, has been kicked out by his Quaker community. And on his way to an auction to buy farm equipment, he's kind of musing to himself. And he's by himself, but he's kind of thinking if he had his kids with him. And he said, in the event that he came upon a runaway, how good it would be for his children to witness Christian charity, thinking he'd probably save the runaway, right? The thought bore into his mind as he drove that by purchasing a slave, a man became part of an injury wrought not just on another human being, but on the entire society. So despite these thoughts, though, the action of the novel really starts when he returns from that auction with a slave. How does this happen? And I guess, do you think it's inevitable in that time and place? He's in southwestern Virginia in 1798.
Well, the story began for me when I learned that my paternal family had been slave owners. And this was extremely shocking. Much later, I learned that they'd been Quakers. And I couldn't put the two things together. I was very interested in Quakerism myself, particularly in high school. I got involved with Quakers, and I knew quite a lot about the way Quakers reason through problems, and I just couldn't imagine how that jump could have been made by Daniel. And I kept asking my father, and of course he didn't have any idea, and perhaps he wasn't interested, perhaps he was ashamed, but he didn't want to go there. And so I spent a lot of time in my life thinking about this man and what might have motivated him. And also, why was he kicked out? Why was he disowned by the Quakers? Why had he come to southwestern Virginia, which was virtually uninhabited in the first place? And I started going back through records, and I figured all that out. I figured out, what his little, actually sort of would seem to us, minor sin had been. And yet, at that time, if you took a family of 7 children into the forest of southwestern Virginia, you needed some help. You really couldn't do much on your own. And he had little kids, and he had a brand new wife who was 15 years old, which was part of his problem. So I reasoned that this must have been the temptation. Let's say the temptation. And I decided that had he gone to an auction and seen a small child, not a small child, but a young boy, he might have thought, well, I could help him and he could help me. Of course, it was a foolish thing to do because the boy was not very much good at anything, and he was too young to have any strength. So there goes the story. That was the beginning, and all the comeuppance from that first purchase, because this family of mine ended up with a lot of slaves over 2 generations. And it's something, I don't know if anyone here has that background, or if you have it, if you know about it, but it's something worth thinking about, I think. And even if we don't have that in our background, we have the complicity of it in our history, all of us. So I just got very interested.
Well, there was a few interesting things here for me was in the first book, in The Purchase, there really is no labor market whatsoever in Virginia. There is no people that he could hire to help him build a house, even if he wanted. There's no one there. There's a few families. They have a couple slaves, and they're just barely surviving. There's no extra people. So I thought that was very interesting. The other thing that goes throughout both books is this contradiction between being Quakers or having a Quaker background and owning slaves. Mm-hmm. And it comes out in all these strange ways. That there's kind of this overt familiarity with the slaves that the other families in the area certainly don't have. At one point, they hired a runaway. At one point, the eldest daughter, Mary, lives like in a lean-to or a small structure with one of the other slaves, raising a child. Two women, the woman slave and Mary.
No one in the family was very happy about that, I might add.
No, but they don't stop her, right? It's going on.
Yeah.
And so they have this guilt, but they're still exploiting these people. They're still in that master-slave relationship, aren't they?
Absolutely, absolutely.
So do you feel that when you were thinking about the setting of this book and the Quakers and then that contradiction, did you feel that those relationships were kind of skewed because of the Quakers trying to hold on to some moral, like most families in that area of Virginia would not have stood for Mary living with the female slave outside of the house, right?
True, I suppose so. Yeah. Well, we're a strange and iconoclastic bunch, we Dickinsons. We do all kinds of things that other people wouldn't do. But Mary, of course, is the daughter of the first wife, who was a very devout Quaker. And the family is split by this marriage to this young girl after the first mother dies. And the young girl is an orphan and a Methodist. and in those days, that kind of thing made a huge difference. So the kids, of the children of the Methodist mother are going to be quite different in their viewpoint. But Mary still carries this old Pennsylvania Quaker sensibility, and she's quite proud of it. She's rather ashamed of her father for what he's done.
So that all this, what we talked about, takes place in the first book. So the second book opens up many years later, 40 years after the closing of the first book. And an abolitionist comes into the community, and now the family owns over a dozen slaves, and they have like 3,000 acres of land, a huge amount of land. They have cotton, and an abolitionist shows up from Canada.
And he's real, by the way. He's historically accurate. All these people are real, by the way.
So he seemed very naive, and yet he is able to spark a slave exodus, and he doesn't lose his life. So I was like, so you said he's real. Tell us about him and how he gets to Virginia.
He came from Belleville, Ontario, and he was an ardent young man who went to medical school in New York and became interested in abolition. Although he was Canadian, he got very involved in it. You know, there was a fiery thing going on with John Brown and all those guys at that point, where you were sort of on one side of the fence or the other. And he decided he was going to go into the South. He was also a naturalist as well as a doctor. And he identified himself as an ornithologist. And this is all historically true to the time and place. And he went to plantations and asked the plantation owners if he could walk into their fields and look at their birds. He was studying birds. I have him studying a particular kind of bird, but and these guys fell for it, and then he would go out there and talk to the slaves, and apparently he managed to get 30 or 40 slaves into Canada, not taking them personally, but giving them the routes, giving them maps, telling them what signals to look for on the Underground Railroad and all that sort of thing.
So Martin, who later befriends the bear, he overhears what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. He's the 13-year-old son of the preacher John, who only has one slave. It's the brother Benjamin, who actually has over a dozen. But he overhears this plan, and yet he doesn't do anything. And he's his best friend is a slave at that point in time, and the decision haunts him through the novel. Like he's very conflicted about this, Martin, whether he did the right thing or the wrong thing by not exposing this abolitionist in their midst.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he overhears the plans one night in one of the cabins and does not report back to the family about it. And you know, I've forgotten now. You may know. You've read it more recently than I have, but I've forgotten how many actually escape. But
it's about a dozen.
Do they? I don't think they all escape.
No, about 8, yeah. I think.
Because later they're freed.
Right, there's a few were freed, yeah.
Anyway, the interesting thing about it, it's funny, I have a doctor friend in Toronto who read the book, and he said, you know, it never occurred to me that these people really depended on the slaves for their livelihood. That when the slaves left, they went broke, right? And I'm not trying to say that we should pity them or forgive them, but I mean, it was a big deal to have these guys freed or whatever. So the family does go broke, in fact.
Yeah, and a lot of Martin's guilt is over the ruin of his family. Like, they lose all 3,000 acres, and they start heading towards Kansas, which is, you know, a repeat in a way of when they went from Pennsylvania 50 years earlier to the wilds of Virginia where there was nothing. So now they're going out to Missouri or Kansas where there's nothing.
They're actually headed for Missouri because Missouri was still a slave state, and Kansas was in that iffy period of trying to decide whether it was going to be slave or free. And that's where all the beginning of the Civil War happened, was along that borderline between Missouri and Kansas. It's fantastic history. I mean, before the Civil War, they were blowing each other up like mad, burning down each other's, you know, towns and everything.
Was that so you say a lot of it is based on the history of the particular family or the people. So I was curious, is that dictated what time periods you set the novels by that history, or was some of it that you wanted to move close to that period where John Brown was active and you could come into some of that pre-Civil War foment that was going on?
Well, I know when the family got to Kansas, and within a year or two. So I did just decide, based on a couple of battles and things, whether it was going to be 1856 or 1858, which we don't really know. But yeah, it was hairy times out there, and my family would not have chosen to go to Kansas. They would have chosen to go to Missouri, but Missouri was also chock full of people at that point. And all the Southerners were moving over there in order and bringing their slaves. So yeah.
There's a piece of the novel where Martin, to me, plays like an idealized version of Huck Finn. He's secretly, they're on a boat and they have their wagon and he's hiding a slave, and like Huck Finn, they're going down the Mississippi, except Martin actually has a plan. Was that in your mind, that kind of parallel to Huck Finn a little bit, or is it just, again, was there some family history?
It bothered. I was a little bit worried about it. Is this just too much of a meme or whatever? But I read some stories where those things did happen, and it was a big boat. What fascinated me about studying the move westward is these guys would leave Virginia or wherever it was in their covered wagons, their Conestoga wagons, and often they put them on steamboats. So, you would take your big wagon and all your animals onto these riverboats. I never knew that. And then, of course, the dangers of those riverboats were huge because they were always blowing up or sinking or, whatever. Terrible things happened on those riverboats. So it was quite precarious, but it was quick. You got out west pretty fast if you went on the Mississippi and then jumped down to the Missouri and went right across the state of Missouri.
So the slave he's trying to save is Bry, who appears in both books.
Right.
And he's trying to get to Canada, and he has some of his own adventures too. So what I find so interesting in the book is you get the real feel for all the different things that were happening on the frontier in the United States at that point in time. You kind of have slavery and runaway slaves, but you also have native people. You have adventurers. You have all sorts of people. And Bry ends up not hooking up is kind of the wrong word, but he ends up in partnership with a native woman. What can you tell us about that? And what was the native life like in Missouri and Kansas as all these settlers were rushing out there?
Well, it was enormous. It was this land was full of native people. We talked about that yesterday here on the stage. This was a world of many nations, and they were complex, and they spoke different languages, and so on. And the other thing that I fell in love with is that the guys who really did all the discovering were the French Canadians. French Canadians who came down with, they portaged with their huge canoes down all the rivers, and they actually got to the far west before Lewis and Clark did. They knew every tribe, they knew every animal, they knew every, set of rapids and waterfall all the way out west. And so they were really the great guides. And in my part of Kansas, in Topeka, I found out that there's a huge group of French Indian families who, the Indian women, I'm not supposed to say Indian, never mind, the native people women were given land grants north of the river in Topeka. And there are, like I grew up with a girl named Suzanne Robinette. Well, Robinette's heirs or ancestors would have been French Canadians married into native stock. So it's a story that really should be told. It's just fascinating.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. As they're going through the towns, they're all French. They go to Louisville, right?
Yeah.
That St. Louis is largely French even at that point in time.
Absolutely. And, the young girls would be sent to Catholic schools and would be speaking French, and that's how it was in Louisville and St. Louis and New Orleans and all those places.
Yeah, up and down the whole Mississippi, really.
And it wasn't just because of the portageurs. Obviously, they wouldn't have had lots of money, and they were zooming around. But the rich French Canadians would have come in to settle and, do the business of trade. So it was all trade.
It seemed like in the book, you have these vibrant kind of French Canadian cities with the natives and all these kind of rustic elements, and then you have the wagon train, which is really like a bunch of evangelist, buttoned up tight Christians suddenly being inserted into this world,
inserting themselves into
yes.
it. Yeah.
And that was quite. I feel like we're still living with that that incursion in some ways.
Yeah, we sort of clawed our way to the top.
The culture clash.
Yeah, I know. But that was why I was so fascinated with John Ralston Saul's talk yesterday about the comeback, because we just have no idea how much native wit and lore and culture is out there around us that we aren't.
So a lot of the relationships in the book are tough. These are people who are trying to survive, and like I said, you're dealing. One of the main characters in the Reckoning is John Dickinson, who's a preacher, and he's pretty harsh. He's harsh with his family. He's a tough man. But there is one relationship that is gentle and authentic and beautiful, and that's the relationship between Martin and this adopted bear cub. What can you tell us about that? And then after maybe you talk a little bit, I'd like to have you read a little section.
Well, again, as a child, I always picture myself as a child in the back seat of my father's car, which is a big, ancient old Lincoln, because he would never trade it in for a new car. And I was constantly throwing up in the back seat. That's another thing, but never mind. So we, being told stories, and one of the stories had to do with Cuff, which was this bear that left Virginia with the family. And imagine, as a child, being told that. I mean, I was just so compelling. And I wanted to know all about the bear. And of course, nobody knew about the bear. And then I would lean back in the back seat and start brooding and looking out the window and thinking, they probably killed the bear. They probably killed the bear. Where's the bear? And I would say, what happened to the bear? And, well, we don't know. We don't really remember. But we know that the bear existed and that the bear's name was Cuff. And so another long, rambling series of daydreams through my life that I wanted to deal with this bear. And I did. I think I did well by Cuff.
I love Cuff. I love Cuff. He does such a great character. So could I have you read this piece? This is a piece, if I can set up a little bit, and you can add whatever you'd like, obviously, that they're in the wagon train. They've gone quite a while. They've been without the patriarch of the family, John Dickinson, but now he is returning.
He's abandoned them.
He's abandoned them.
Point, but now he's thought better of it. And this also is historical, that John disappeared for some time and told his family to go on. He was not going to go with them. After he'd made all the plans to go to Kansas, he said, "You go, I'm staying." Can imagine how his wife felt about that. And now he's caught up. And there are two. There's a little girl in the wagon, but there are also two sort of middle teenagey kind of kids. Martin, who's 13, and his sister, who's a little older. And the night that the father shows up on his horse, she has gone off into town to do some errand and has met up with a young boy or a young man, and he's tempted her. I keep using that word, temptation. It sounds so old Christian, but anyway, he's tempted her to go over into a little dark cabin where there's some dancing, and to come in and dance with him. So, and her name is Electa, which I think is a wonderful name for a girl. She's part of this. I'm telling you that just because she's part of this scene. So Martin knows that his father's back, and he's run off with Cuff because he's scared, because his father never wanted Cuff to come on the journey in the wagon with the wagon, and he now sees that this is going to be a problem.
How big is Cuff at this
Cuff
point?
is a yearling.
So 90 pounds, maybe?
Yeah, so, yeah, which is the size of my dog, so that was easy, yeah. In the woods, Martin had thrown himself down with Cuff, who was settled with her heavy head on his narrow shoulder. Having grown past the habit, Cuff suddenly searched with her tongue for Martin's left ear. "What shall we do?" Martin whispered, running his hand over her nose and loving her more than ever. "Shall we go back?" There was a knobby bone in the middle of Cuff's skull, just under the fur, and he liked to rub it, and he did that now while looking into her small eyes, which were close together and rimmed in black, as if she had come from another planet. He nestled under her bristly chin and held her paw and felt each long, curved claw with his fingers, and it was much like the hand-holding Electa was then performing with the boy in the shack in candlelight. For they too had found something not to be forfeited. While Martin held the bear, Electa held the boy and put her face against his neck. When Cuff rolled over on the ground, Electa threw her head back and led the boy outside. Martin lay against the bear's stomach, grabbed a foot, and found the place between two toes where Cuff was most ticklish, while Electa gave her boy a tender shove, and he fell clumsily onto the grass. Girl and boy and bear. An hour or more while mortals held fast to each other, vowing that no one would come between them, not ever, that they would become dance partners, go into business together, learn each other's language, that neither would ever again catch a fish for anyone else, till death us do part. Cuff put a paw against Martin's throat as if taking his pulse. Unaccustomed to such melancholy, the two of them got up off the forest floor and began walking back to the campsite, where Dickinsons were trying to reshape their lives. Seeing his approach, Lavina, mother, wanted Martin to pull Cuff in the other direction, away from the father, who had made them get up in the middle of the night because Electa was finally back and her late return had further maddened him. Wasn't he kicking at a wheel and raising his voice? Hadn't he even raised his hand to his daughter? With all the campers quiet, trying to sleep or listening, wasn't he provoking them to hear every word of his shameful, humiliating rant? Lavina, who had been fully in charge all these weeks, was now mortified.
Yeah, that's this wonderful scene. There's so many themes that are running through there. You know, we talked briefly, John had abandoned the family, and the mother had gotten them this far, further than other families gotten, and they were all intact. And then he shows up, and it just goes back to the way it was, which I would say she was doing a better job than he ever would have done getting them there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You know, some of that was inspired in me by, well, first of all, I knew that he had actually fallen back and not gone with the family. But when I lived in Hawaii many years ago, there were all these guys who went off on submarine trips. Because I lived close to the Marine base. And I used to watch, and for 6 months, the mothers in those houses would run everything beautifully. And the kids would be, you know, everything would be fine. And the dads would come home, having been out of the picture, and all hell would break loose. You know, they'd want instant control, they'd want instant this and instant that, and it just didn't work. It was so fascinating. Even, you know, as a very young mother, I was quite interested in what happened with those kids and the wives who were sort of pushed back against the kitchen wall, you know.
Yeah, I mean, you want her, it's 1850, so that makes it tough, but you want her to just tell him to go to hell, right? I mean, you just want him, you know.
On the other hand, she's going to have a pretty hard time not having a man out there in the West. So, yeah. She was mad. She was grumpy.
Yeah, she had Martin and the bear. But, and one of the reasons she doesn't have, they do have an older son, but the father has already chased the older son off.
Yeah. Supposedly out looking for land somewhere. Yeah.
So, the books are told in the third person from multiple points of view, including those of the slaves. How do you figure out who gets featured in the story and when? And when writing the experiences of of men, a different gender, of people of different race, people in a different time. What considerations go into creating those characters, and are they different than if you were writing about a contemporary woman?
Yes, of course they're different, but not entirely different. And that goes for gender, and that goes even for race, although I've gotten some trouble for saying and believing that. It feels to me that if we cannot put ourselves into other times and places and skins, then we shouldn't be writing. I mean, we may not do it well, we may not do it accurately, we cannot absolutely turn back the clock, of course, but it is our job. That is what we're here for. I mean, that is what our brains want to do. And writers tend to have enormous quantities of empathy for their characters. I was once told by a writer friend, Russell Banks, years and years and years ago, when I asked him some question about writing, and he said, you have to love all of your characters, even the really evil ones, which took me aback, as a beginning writer. But in fact, it's true. You have to empathize, otherwise you can't do your job, which is to show the reader, to help the reader into those lives. And so it's tricky right now to be writing about slaves. It's a very unpopular move. It's something that an old white lady like me is not supposed to do. But I feel like those people were part of my family's past. And I also feel, and the reason I think this book is called A Reckoning is because all of us are part of that history. And we can't deny it, and we have to acknowledge, it's like yesterday, we can't apologize, really. We can, but what good would it do? But we can recognize where we fall in that pattern and how incredibly fortunate, how what's the right word I'm looking for? How we've succeeded in ways that we might not have succeeded without that slavery past. And it's a horrible thing to acknowledge, right? And that's why I think we have to be able to write in all those voices so that we can feel those voices and think about them and hear them and imagine, whether rightly or wrongly, what was going on in those people's minds and hearts, all of them. I mean, even my grumpy great-great-grandfather, he had his problems. He actually had his standards, and I had to come to grips with his point of view as well.
When you're putting this book together, what was the hardest aspect of it? Was there any of those leaps of the imagination that were particularly difficult that you thought I have to do more research on this, or did it kind of flow because you had lived with this story in your family for so long?
Well, the one thing I was really afraid to write about was a Native woman. Mm-hmm. In the purchase, I didn't have one Native character because I thought, I'll get it wrong, I'll mess up, I'll get in trouble, it'll be too slick or it'll be too silly. So I just stayed away from that. And I thought, this is ridiculous. This is a huge part of our past. And there's no way that they didn't occur in this story, right? So let's confront it. Let's talk about it. And I don't know whether I did it. I don't know how I did with it, but I at least, made an effort to include that, because that's just like the French Canadians. That's part of what happened. That's the big picture.
How did you choose?
But that was hard. That was scary.
So how did you come upon that character? That character is a very sympathetic.
I just read and read because the Sioux were having a huge war, and then there were Native people in Upper Missouri and Kansas were being kicked off the land and sent down to Oklahoma. But you had to get the right tribal thing, and you had to know a bit about what was going on, and one could research that for 10 years or 10 weeks and still probably get it wrong, but that's what I did. I just wanted to find the right the right person in the right place. Right.
So the other interesting aspect, another interesting aspect I thought was, so you were raised in Topeka, but you've been in Canada now for over 35 years, right? Mm-hmm. And Ross, the abolitionist who comes from Canada and incites the slaves to escape, when he's back in Canada, you have a moment where he's contemplating. And he says the United States had tired him out. And he thinks it was not a communal country, but rather devoted to the individual and to personal gain. He felt that arguing was the primary occupation of people in the United States. So,
How prescient was he?
well, that's my question, I guess. So this is 1855 when he's thinking that, and it feels just as true today, right? So can you write a historical novel with one eye to the present, or do these similarities just kind of slip in?
Well, it was fascinating because the stuff that was going on there was just mad and crazy. They had I can't remember all the names of all the parties, but the political scene was completely wacko. And they were having protests, and they were shooting each other. And of course, the Kansas-Missouri thing, as I said, was, literally burning each other's towns away. I mean, Lawrence was invaded by the Confederates and so forth. And this was all before the Civil War. So it was it's a fractious country down here,
Does being in Canada give you
I think if we'd stayed a colony, we might have managed things better. I don't know.
Does being in Canada give you a different viewpoint than you think you could have had here?
Absolutely. And living in Hawaii gave me a different viewpoint. If you want to, I read a wonderful thing in the New York Times recently. If you want to understand racism, go to Hawaii, because it's the one place in this country where it is entirely diverse, and there really isn't a stacking order. There used to be, but pretty much now everybody's so intermingled and racially mixed that it's a fascinating place to be. So that taught me a lot, and Canada has taught me a similar thing. Although when I moved to Canada in the 80s, it didn't feel as diverse to me, and I thought, why is everyone in their little separate nooks? Why are the Hungarians over here and the Italians here and so forth? But having lived there for long enough and watched it change, it's become, Toronto in particular, and Vancouver, enormously diverse places where it just works. It just works, I mean, you don't see racial hatred in Canada. Am I right? I'm right? I don't know why it works. It works partly because they don't have the history of slavery. The slavery in Canada was brief. It was over in the 1830s, and it was never a plantation system. So the slaves in Canada were brought up, or were brought in to serve in houses. They were servants. Mostly. I don't know how many field slaves there were in Canada, or why there would have been. So, and then it was over, and then it was over. And then, of course, there was the Underground Railroad, where they opened the gates, which Canada is very good at doing, and that wasn't entirely wonderful. There were things that happened. I once heard that the Quakers, who fostered all of that movement north, didn't actually like the former slaves to sit in their meeting houses with them. I'm not sure if that's true, but I have heard that. So, it's nothing is perfect, but it's always a work in progress. And in Canada, you feel it. You feel it on the street every day. And in the States, I don't feel it. I just don't feel it here right now. I mean, I feel this great division.
Well, we're still dealing with this horrible, or not dealing with this legacy of slavery.
Absolutely.
And the Canadian legacy is so different. There was refuge there, so.
Right, and a great many of the, they're not African Americans who live in Canada, they're African Canadians, but they have come up from the Caribbean, and they're not necessarily former slaves, or if they were former slaves ancestrally, it's a very different story. So they don't bear this grudge for the people who are surrounding them, It's just the anger isn't there.
Yeah.
I don't feel it.
Well, your book gave me a real understanding in as only a novel can do in some ways of the field slaves in a way. Like in Virginia, in this part of Virginia, when they first get there in 1800, there isn't really much call for field slaves, but then they develop a new strain of cotton.
Yeah.
And that changes everything. Suddenly, that's what you're going to do with all these acres.
That's
Where
right.
before that, you needed a slave to help build the house, or maybe they thought it was much less slavery than what happened once cotton came in. And cotton, of course, can't grow in Canada, right?
Thank goodness, yeah. Well, there was tobacco and there was rice, and the slaves were useful for both of those products, and particularly in the Deep South, which was tobacco country, and also the Southeast. But the cotton thing, as you will hear this afternoon and during the cotton talk, really changed the picture. And when Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, which they thought would necessitate fewer slaves because the gin was going to do all the work. In fact, it ate cotton so fast that they needed more slaves to grow the cotton, and it was upland cotton now and not lowland and so forth, and all hell broke loose. And of course, Britain was buying it. So Britain was always pro-Confederate.
So I want to ask you one last question before we ask the audience for questions. And I'm always curious about this. When you were writing The Purchase, did you know that you were going to write a reckoning? Or was it somewhere during the process of writing? Or was it after you're finished writing and you said, there's more to this story, I want to jump ahead 40 years?
Actually, I wanted to write Reckoning more than I wanted to write. I always wanted to write a Reckoning because it was the story of the trip to Kansas, which fascinated me because of the bear and blah, blah, blah. But, and I wanted to do it as one big book. And my both agent and editors said, oh, you can't do that. You've got this 40-year jump. No, don't do, that's a really bad idea. I don't know. Was it a bad idea? But so then I had to write The Purchase in order to earn the right to write a Reckoning.
All right, well, thank you. So we're going to open it up to some questions from the audience.
We have microphones on this side and this side. So if you put up your hand, then we'll know you want to ask a question. We can bring it to you. Maya, you want to give it to this lady here? You don't have to switch the mic on or off. It's all controlled from the side. So you can think about it. Worry about it.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm interested in knowing, in Canada, do you have the hyphenated African-Canadian terminology?
We don't, not that I know of.
Up to your
I
mic.
don't think so. No,
Everyone's Canadian.
everyone's Canadian. You might be Asian, you might be, I don't think we use the term African much, do we? I don't think so. You might say Black Canadian if you felt like it or you wanted to make a distinction, but
Because I know that was emphasized in one of the panels yesterday, how in America we do, and why we're not all Americans.
Right.
And we keep the hyphenated image.
and also it's inaccurate because not every Black person is, I mean, anyway, so yeah. Come on, you guys, make it hard, yeah.
We also have a gentleman right here.
I'm actually also working on something in that 1800, 1850 period. But the question is there opportunity for another sequel during the kind of Reconstruction period? For instance, what happened in Kansas and Missouri after the Civil War, after that time?
I would love to do that, and I actually have a lot of material, but, God, I mean, I'm old, you know. I don't have time. So I've got this other thing I want to do, which has more to do with the World War II period, and that's what I'm presently working on. But I really have some great stuff about that period. If you want, I'll share it with you.
Yes, okay. So in Virginia, you raised cotton, and they were cotton with slaves and so forth. But when you moved to Kansas, what were you growing?
They were growing.
Kansas is not necessarily a cotton state.
Definitely not. No, in Kansas, the family did grow wheat, and they did that without slaves, because slaves didn't cross the border, presumably, although I think there was some cheating going on. But my family did not move westward with any slaves in tow. And the fact that they ended up in Kansas was a slight mistake, but you'll have to read the book to find out why. But it's a great story. Wheat. And of course, the great personal tragedy for me is that a generation or two later, they decided, for very kinky reasons, to go back to Missouri and left all the fabulous wheat land that would have made me a very wealthy woman. But,
Thank you.
One of the interesting lines in the book was the abolitionists, when he's trying to convince them to let him into the fields to watch birds, he has dinner with a family, and he just says some what they feel are outrageous things. And one of them is that he's complicit in slavery, the abolitionist is from Canada, because he's wearing a cotton shirt. And they just think he's joking or something, don't they? They can't fathom this reasoning.
do you remember all the protests that we all did about grapes and things like that? I mean, we've sort of lost that. I remember not buying anything at the grocery store that was made by Dow Chemical, and not eating grapes because of the protest in California and so forth. In the days that we're talking about here, the Quakers wouldn't wear anything dyed with indigo, because indigo, which is that beautiful blue that you see on lots of the incredibly beautiful cotton from India and silk from India, was raised by slaves. So you didn't wear indigo if you were a Quaker. You didn't wear cotton if you were an abolitionist, and so forth. I mean, that's just, I love all that. And this is something that the United States is great with, is our various, firm hold on protest. Not so much in Canada. We're so much more, benign.
If you stand, they can actually see you back there with your mic. Can you just stand up for a second?
What do you think about teaching history through stories, through books, rather than history books? It seems that in this country we don't remember our history at all. And I wonder if fiction, historical fiction, can connect people with our history so that they would understand not just the data, but the
feelings,
attitudes,
the emotions.
of what what you just said about indigo blue. You never read that in a history book.
No, right.
You would read it in a novel, however.
No, I agree, and I think the thing that the novel gives us is the interiority of the character, although, as I say, it may be completely off from what, I don't know, Levina, my great-great-grandmother, did she really feel this or that, So you take a risk, but then there's the good thing of actually having to embed yourself in it. And so that, I'm speaking as the writer. As the reader, the only problem is that a lot of historical fiction isn't very good, or is sloppy or whatever. But how do we learn about, I'm doing a lot of research in World War II, and it's certainly more interesting to read something that's gripping and personal, as opposed to just these. I have dozens and dozens of books about which battles happened. Yeah.
So as a historical novelist, do you feel you have to have complete fidelity to the history, or is there a certain fidelity to creating the piece of literature, because the literature is not necessarily history, or do you have to do both?
I think you have to do both. I think you want to, you don't want to misrepresent history.
Right.
And so, and the fun part of it is doing the research, for sure. I don't want to create a battle in Kansas that didn't happen, or burn down a town that didn't get burned down. That would be, I think, just plain inappropriate and wrong-headed. Yeah, and you know, but to imagine what it was like on a steamboat, and after doing a lot of research, thank goodness we have those books, by the way, because those of us who write historical novels couldn't do it without all the boring stuff. Yeah, but yeah, no, I think you have to try and be accurate.
All right, do we have some more questions from out here?
I have a question. So, I was really fascinated to hear you talk about how when the slaves were freed, that some families would go broke, and how that, shift in our culture, our country, was economic topsy-turvy for so many people,
Yeah.
and how that's very much analogous to what's going on today with our movement towards renewable energies and, people that have livelihoods in the fracking industry, that, and how, I'm just curious how what we experienced in our country years ago, like we're kind of experiencing it again, and what we could learn from that.
That is so interesting. I hadn't thought about that quite that way. That's amazing to think of. I've always felt when the people I disagree with politically say, oh, but we have to have the jobs, therefore we have to have coal miners, or therefore we have to have coal, or therefore we have to whatever. I've always thought, well, that's a crappy excuse. There's always got to be another way for a person to work. But of course there isn't always another way for a person to work. And there may be a generation that's lost in there, that's hovering on poverty. So, but all I can say is that the wrongness of something, because it feeds you, is still wrong. All right? Fracking it's just a bad idea, and coal mining now is a bad idea, and so forth. And we just have to make that jump, and people will be hungry. But we, particularly now, we have this short range, long picture, big picture, that really needs immediate reversal. And I think we can't be too soft-hearted about the workers who get unemployed. Oh, just let me say one more thing. There was an interesting movement, and it was called, if I can think of the right name, apparently my family was part of it. I can't think of the name of it right now. But there were a whole group, they were called Free Soilers, and they wanted the government to buy their slaves, right? So, and that's kind of an interesting idea. It's like, well, we got ourselves into this mess, but you get us out, because if you want us to give up our slaves, if you're going to make a law about that, then you have to recompense us. And that's another kind of interesting wavelength to consider. Should you be paid for your sins, in a way, in order to release them? Anyway.
Well, now we only do that with banks. Right? I mean, the banks get bailed out, right? Isn't that exactly really?
Absolutely right. Yeah.
I'm not sure how to word this question. I'm curious about the term you used when you were referring to black people around us bearing a grudge.
Around what, pardon me?
Around us, that black people bear a grudge. And I'm curious about the term. I'm not sure exactly how that's meant. And it made me think, well, how do I feel? I'm often in the company of black people, and there are black people in my family. And I'm wondering how that history, I do have a concern about that. How does this black person feel towards me because of my family's history? But would I feel like they bear a grudge, or is there another term that maybe would explain how they feel towards me or towards white people in general? And I'm not sure how you were thinking when you said bear a grudge.
Well, it's an awkward word. I think the thing is that for those of us who are white, first of all, there's the acknowledgement of the entitlement we are born with. We just get a break right at birth. And if you're born not white, you must come to realize that at some point. And how could you not mind? How could you not mind that that simple distinction has excluded you from so many entitlements? You know, ease at getting into schools or into jobs or whatever, you know, starting from ground zero. So, I mean, maybe the word grudge is a bit ugly, and maybe it's not a universal feeling, but it's certainly got to be there somewhere. And yeah, okay, I can imagine that I mean, it's a horrible feeling. And if you've been in any sort of inner city situations in the U.S., which I have a fair bit, and you just feel this palpable guilt that these guys. In fact, yesterday in Boulder, I was walking around, and there were 3 guys sitting on a outside step, and I immediately felt some guilt that I was off and about doing my thing, and they were not. And how much of that is, you know, on me? I mean, I know it's kind of stupid, but I grew up that way. I just have always had that sense of. I also came out of Topeka, which is where the nation's schools were desegregated, if you all remember. And so I was part of that in the 4th grade. I was part of the very first classes that were integrated, and immediately became aware of, you know, my status versus the 2 black girls who were in my class. And that sat heavily on my shoulders. I mean, maybe I'm a weirdo, but I just think, you know, you got to think about, doesn't mean that in your family everyone's sitting around the dining room table having a grudge, but that somewhere in our consciousness we're aware of that things are easier for white people.
And I agree with you. I guess.
I'm sorry.
Oh.
It's a great conversation. We can continue it later, but we have time for only one more very quick question. So I'd like to bring this lady.
I'll talk to you afterwards.
And then
Okay.
afterwards, are you signing books?
Sure.
Yeah, she'll be signing books
Hope
right
so.
right downstairs. We have both a reckoning and the purchase.
I think I said the question backwards. I was
Okay,
thinking
we're
it
ready
was
for the
a-
next question. So,
I would like to suggest that the problem is with the word grudge.
Yeah.
Because grudge itself implies that someone is holding something and that the holder is the person who's at fault. And that another word to embody, just as a old white woman, I have to carry the history of my family and my country and understand that. Someone who is a person of color has to carry the history that they and their family have had to experience. That is not a grudge. That is something truly authentic.
Absolutely right.
Exactly. So it's not something that the other, the non-white individual, has to get rid of. It's something that we, as a culture and a country, need to be willing to actually talk about.
That's brilliant. I love that. But I don't think that's how I feel what the meaning of grudge is. But you must be right. I
believe I am.
It's probably a bad word.
Okay.
Resentful?
Okay.
Yeah.
all right. So, thanks everybody for coming, and thank you, Linda.
Yeah. Thank you, guys.
And Linda will be signing right down at the foot of the stairs, and we have both books available. Thank you.